Okay, hello, good evening. Welcome to WiseTalks, our regular series of discussions where we invite folks from companies that we admire to join us to talk through some important topics that we think are relevant to our mission here at Wise, whether it's product or engineering or scaling, operations, marketing, or anything in between those things. We're streaming this live on LinkedIn today, but for the first time in a while, we're actually gathering face-to-face here in our London office to talk about international expansion, or taking a product to new markets and then hopefully growing those markets. I'm Sharon, I head up expansion product teams here at Wise, and I'm joined by Matt Henderson, who leads the EMEA business for Stripe. So let's start with some quick intros. I will go first. I'm Sharon, I've been at Wise for 2 years now, and like many of us here, I joined after experiencing that pain of moving money between countries or currencies. For me, I've been an expat in Australia, and that was actually before Wise got there. But then in Hong Kong recently was where I realized just how bad those hidden exchange rates are when I tried to send money back to the UK. And as an expansion team here at Wise, what we do is we figure out where we're going to expand to and then how we can ultimately achieve product market fit in those countries and help people like me who were overseas and subject to those nasty rates that banks often charge. Our aim is really to build the best-in-class experience, and by doing that, hopefully customers refer us to their friends and we grow our market share through that really organic kind of product work that we do. I'll hand over to Matt for a quick intro.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Hi, everyone. So I'm Matt from Stripe, and maybe I'll start by saying Wise is a company that we admire as well, so it's a privilege to be here. And, I know we also have a few things in common and even some of our missions and what we're trying to do, especially as it pertains to the global market, is similar. So I'm excited for the talk. So I'm the business lead for the EMEA region at Stripe, essentially a kind of a tech-focused GM role. I have product and engineering teams in the region. That's kind of most of my org in Europe. I also manage some emerging businesses like Paystack in Africa, TaxJar in the US, and our Stripe Tax product, which is built out of Europe as well. We're going to talk a bit more about Stripe's mission further on, but for those that don't know, we're a payments company focused really on enabling developers at merchants and often platforms that are internet platforms that they then serve other businesses and other consumers.
Very cool, thanks Matt. Sorry, waiting for slides. So before we start our conversation about expansion, a little bit of context about Wise for those who don't know what we do. Here at Wise, our mission is to make cross-border money movements instant, convenient, transparent, and eventually free. But what does money without borders look like in practice? So essentially, we do this through 3 products, which are used by consumers and businesses alike. So the first one is Wise Transfer, and this is where we believe we're building the best money transfer service that's cheaper and easier to send money overseas. That was where we started out, but we also have our Wise account, which we believe is the world's most international account, and it allows you to hold over 50 currencies and gives you instant, super cheap money transfers, as well as a debit card and the ability to spend that money in any currency. We also let you have banker details so that you can receive money into those accounts and set up things like direct debits and manage your money in any way that you need to. The final part is our Wise platform, and this is where we bring the magic of Wise to different banks and business platforms using our API. And this is something that's already used by companies like Google, Xero, and Stripe.
Exactly. So Stripe's mission is to increase the GDP of the internet. Sounds kind of grand, but it's essentially, you could think of it as trying to enable business that wouldn't have otherwise happened to occur. And the way that we, sort of the 2 main ways that we do that, one is by trying to remove friction from payments. And the other is, so removing friction from payments, by the way, it's often the sort of the sum of thousands of little wins that help to increase conversion rates or make adding new payments capabilities easier to implement. But the other way that we try to enable business to occur that wouldn't have otherwise occurred is by looking at the adjacencies to payments that are often the kind of the workflows that businesses undertake in order to do something that centers around payments. And so one example is that many platforms and marketplaces go through a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting to onboard the supply side of their marketplace. And so we built software to help them to do that. And it turns out that there's often funds flows that are at the heart of that relationship, and so it's relevant for payments. But it was also this software adjacency, and increasingly that's the way that Stripe is sort of pursuing this mission. And I think that's over to you, Sharon.
It is. So back to the topic for today. So what does expansion mean? Both Wise and Stripe are global products at their heart. So of course, expansion is a really core part of what we do in our product teams. But I suspect it looks a little bit different at our respective organizations. So I think the best way to start is we'll talk a little bit about what expansion means at Wise and Stripe. So starting with Wise, when we think about expansion, we think about breadth and depth. So I guess initially we would want to achieve coverage by taking our product to as many different currencies as possible. If you need to send money between borders, then obviously you need to have a presence in those different countries. And the other part of it is once you're in those countries is how do you deepen your product and how do you build out the infrastructure to make it cheaper, faster, more convenient for people by actually integrating progressively deeper into the payment structures that exist in those countries. We also localize our product and think about how we're actually going to take it to market and make it relevant to people. So whether that's adapting the language or the positioning of the product, that's what we mean when we say deepening. And in our expansion teams, we trade off those two things and think about how to invest our time wisely between them. So when we think about coverage, we think about this as a lever for driving growth. And expanding that geographical coverage is one part of what we do. So this image here shows a little bit of how much of that coverage we have. But as well as actually just reaching those countries, we will add more products in those countries. So an obvious example is we'd start by letting consumers use our product to send money, and then we would enable businesses to use it as well. And as I mentioned with the 3 products that we have at Wise, we would start out by letting people send money, but then extending that to having an account and actually being able to use that account to spend money in those different markets. And that's how we serve those different segments of the market and increase our coverage geographically as well as in terms of the use cases that we serve. The second part, as I mentioned, is deepening. And this chart shows a little bit about what that looks like. So when that connectivity gets deeper, we improve the payment infrastructure in those countries and make it more embedded, which makes it less risky and more established, but also, as I mentioned, cheaper, faster, and more convenient. And typically where we start out here is we first enter a market by partnering with other companies that have licenses to get our first entry and test it, and then get our own licenses and build out that network of partners who help us build a better quality product for our customers. We then start removing things like payment limits or annoying things that mean that customers can't use our product as freely as they want to. The gold standard for us is when we directly connect to payment schemes, and we've done this in the UK and Hungary and Singapore recently, and hopefully a few more on the way. The final part is, I guess, the visualization and the localization of this, and a really good example is when we launched our debit card recently in Japan. Clearly what we needed to do there was different to what we did in the UK, and it's not just the language, it's a little bit about how you actually make this feel relevant to people in those different countries. So I'm going to hand over to Matt and hear a little bit about what expansion looks like at Stripe.
So before I jump into some of the stuff on this slide, I was going to just add that that one of the similarities between Wise and Stripe that I think is different from a lot of tech companies is just the degree that what it will take to provide a good user experience in a new country is often substantially different than what you may have already in other countries. And so before Stripe, I was at Google, and there were many Google products that you could launch into a new country just by changing the language or by changing the currency or something like that. You know, a hard country was like a right-to-left language or something like that. So with the common thread for us, for Wise and Stripe, is that, there'll be fundamental regulatory differences or bank partners or whatever else that payment schemes that need to be considered in a country. And that requires like a degree of depth that's just a different type of investment. I think that actually makes international expansion harder, and it certainly means that that there's more complexities and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our version of breadth and depth. You know, we have the equivalent, and in my teams in Europe, you know, we have probably right now about 100 in product engineering that are working in depth features for Europe specifically, and then we have probably you know, a dozen or so that are working specifically on country expansion within the EMEA region. So actually only a sort of a small minority are working on new countries, and a lot are working on depth. And that's quite different than what the proportion was maybe sort of 4 or 5 years ago, where we're still rolling out Stripe across European countries. Right, so here I'm going to talk a bit about country expansion and launching a new country. The thing with cards, which our business leans more towards, is that there's a difference between just being able to accept a card transaction and actually providing a great cost-effective service for the merchant and for the end customer. So Stripe users can accept card payments from customers in 190 countries around the world, so essentially everywhere, in 135 currencies. So there's a lot of breadth there. However, what we think of when we say Stripe is now live in 44 countries is that a merchant in one of those 44 countries can get the kind of the full strength of domestic card acquiring, and that ends up being better for a number of reasons, and it also is something that that it can take some work to set up. And so when we think about country expansion, the kind of first thing on our minds is enabling this domestic acquiring for Stripe users. And then the kind of concentric circles here are sort of symbolizing Stripe countries and everywhere else. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk through an example. If you were a merchant in the US and you sold something to a customer in Germany, and you were just using the cross-border card transaction. So let's say it's a $100 transaction. I'm going to test the limits of the slide turnover time here. But let's say it's a $100 transaction. Click. You would pay about like more than, I think it's $3. Yeah, more than $3 in fees. So it's kind of crazy expensive, right? And so I know all of you are in the business of hating cross-border like costs and trying to get them down lower. So it's the same for us, and we're trying to do that on behalf of our users. And so the more that we light up the world with the ability to do domestic acquiring, the more that that our users are able to then set up entities and accounts and benefit from that. And so in this case, a US parent company could set up domestic acquiring in Germany and change a $3 something fee into something that's more like 10% of that. So it's a really, by the way, not only is it cheaper, but actually the conversion's better. The authorization rate is better as well. So it really makes a big difference. Now here, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the difference in different countries and how we need to take into account that as well. So with country expansion, we're often thinking about that cards first, enabling domestic acquiring. Then when we're thinking about depth, we start thinking about the equivalent of the pie charts here, where how is it that people pay? Because if you're a merchant, you're selling something online, and you only offer cards, and you're hoping to sell things to people in Germany, then it's probably not enough, because cards is one of the smaller segments that I can't read from here, but one of the smaller segments of this pie, and there's a lot of Germans out there that just don't want to transact in cards, and so you have to start thinking about offering SEPA bank transfers. You have to start thinking about doing kind of invoices or PayPal or something like that as well. And so as we add depth in a country, it's often about doing things to address more payment method coverage, as well as building out Stripe's product suite in a country as well. So that's a bit about kind of how we kind of approach country expansion and then building out that depth as well. So back to you, Sharon.
Cool, thanks, Matt. So clearly this is a big investment of time, both for Wise and Stripe, so whether it's this initial coverage or whether it's the deepening of the markets. But how do you set up your organization to do this? What do the teams look like? I think that's probably quite an interesting one to go into, because I think that may be different for us both. I'll start by saying a little bit about how we do this at Wise. So at Wise, we work in autonomous teams, and we talk about this a lot. You've probably seen this on the internet, and it is actually true. And it's quite unique, but we also think it's our superpower. So all of our teams are built around customer problems, and they're all cross-functional. And that means that each of these teams has all of the resources they need in order to solve the problem they're working on. So for example, they'll have engineers, they'll have a product manager, they'll have analysts, maybe marketeers, and all sorts of other functions. And this is definitely true for our expansion teams, who are organized in squads that are distributed between our various global offices, everywhere from London to Singapore to New York, Tallinn, and Budapest. And often a requirement of getting a license to operate in a jurisdiction is to have people based in that location. So our footprint is truly global, not local. And coordinating that from a single hub is only going to slow things down. So each of our expansion teams decides what they're going to do autonomously. And we trust them to do that by ensuring we hire people who we believe can make those decisions. The teams don't have to wait for strategy or approval from management or anyone that's in an ivory tower or a central location. They're the closest to the region's customers, so it makes complete sense that they autonomously decide what's the right thing for us to build at any one time. We see this model across Wise, so not just in expansion. We have lots of these cross-functional teams, and each of them have the resources to independently solve whatever problem they're focusing on. Broadly in the regional expansion group, we've got 4 areas. So we've got the UK, we've got EMEA and LATAM, and North America and APAC. And roughly they're geographically aligned with where they're focusing, but we do have some mixing. So for example, our North America team has folks in Europe as well as over in New York. And within these squads, we have teams who focus on specific currencies sometimes. So for example, Japanese yen or euro, or particular product problems that we have in those regions. So whether it's how we onboard customers to our product in a particular area. And building out our business product or working on those direct integrations are another couple of examples. They're the kind of things that are big enough that we might have a whole team that thinks about how to do it. Obviously, we have some common threads across our regions. So these expansion teams have some support from what we call core or platform teams who build and maintain the critical components that power that money transfer service or our multi-currency account. So the way you would pay in money, for example, there's some commonalities there. And then we have core functions like marketing or treasury or finance or operations. And the support of those teams is critical because they help us build out the end-to-end customer experience. And we have a bit of localization, so it would make sense to have operations in APAC region being based there for the time zones. But then there's other ones like marketing that perhaps are more centralized, and we get a lot of economy from having that set up. I mentioned our autonomous team model is a superpower for us. So just in the past 3 years, we've grown from 35 teams to over 70 and solving all of those different customer problems autonomously, which we think is pretty cool. So I'm going to hand back to you, Matt, and the slides can catch up in a sec to see how you do this.
So I am quite curious about the degree of decentralization that you've used as a model, because I think we're not as decentralized. We have, broadly speaking, sort of 3 types of product engineering teams. We do have some central product engineering teams that will both work on a kind of like a product platform layer that they then might also build a kind of a reference implementation for a product in one country or a group of countries. And then we have some regional orgs. So we have, I have a counterpart for Asia Pacific and a counterpart for LATAM. And then within those orgs, you typically have a group that's pursuing depth that is organized a bit more a bit more around the sort of the project by domain expertise. And so you might have a team of people that work on bank integrations for EMEA, or a team of people that work on wallet payment methods for Asia Pacific. And rather than sort of breaking it down to different country level folks. But then for the launch of a new country, we will go all the way down to a specific country level team. And so in that case, we have a country expansion team, and what tends to happen is they sort of move from location to location in terms of where they're focused on, and so you might have a group of folks that had previously worked together to launch some countries in Europe, and now they're focused on working together to launch, say, the UAE, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And I'm going off piste here, so at the slides, if you're trying to follow along with the slides, just run with it. So getting back to the slides, this is really more about this new country launch type part of expansion, and what we find there is that we have tried before to have it a bit more grouped by domain expertise, which theoretically should be more efficient, because if you think about the different code bases or the different subject matter expertise, like, wouldn't it make sense to have people with expertise in those areas be working on launching in a new country? And what we've found is it doesn't, because for one of them, it's like the 12th most important thing on their list. For another one, it's the 20th. For another one, it's like the first. And everyone gets out of sync, and they need to work together in this kind of chain of dependencies that needs to be aligned. And they need to like feel that it's very important that they reach that goal. And so when we tried to launch countries, in that domain-focused way, it was just taking too long. So recently, well, not recently, last couple of years, we've really been focused around, okay, we're going to launch in the UAE. We're going to have a UAE team. We're going to send a couple of folks out there, for several weeks. We're going to hire some people locally in order to go deep around the country. And if they need to work in a part of the code base where they didn't previously have experience, then so be it. They would go up the learning curve for that new part of the code base, and that relative inefficiency would be worthwhile, because for them it was the first most important thing to launch Stripe in the UAE. So that's how we organised around that model. And then the other thing that we'll find, and what you see on the slide, is there's many different things that, in spite of my talk about the code base, it's not about code. And so really, to work out what to build and what modifications to do, you not only need this group that feels like the UAE team or the country X team, but that group is not just a product team, not just a group of engineers, but is in fact like a lawyer and some user ops people and a salesperson and something else. And they need to really have, sort of over the course of however long this project is, feel a strong sense of identity for that cross-functional team, more so than their functional team. And what we all have also found is that often the cross-functional work, there's a real need to invest in it up front, because getting that right will then influence whether you build the right thing the first time rather than not. And we have found that there's been countries where it's a unique new regulatory environment. We've sort of made a quick interpretation of the best way for us to launch in a country. We've started to build in a certain way, and then we've had a lot of throwaway work because we've realized that it's been better to change course partway in. And so the lessons learned were kind of, it takes time, and to really create this strong cross-functional group and to invest in that cross-functional work up front. And back to you.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Lots of similarities there, lots of shared war stories, and I think expansion is rarely linear. which, yeah, I think we'll talk about that a bit as you reflect on the UAE. And then from the Wise perspective, I'll talk a little about Australia, which is probably a good end-to-end example of how we've done that. And it definitely wasn't linear, and it's definitely had its challenges along the way. So, yeah, moving away from theoretical and thinking a bit about how we've actually done this practically, real examples are always the best way to go. So with Australia, around 6 years ago, we started that journey, and that was way before my time, so I don't claim the credit for having launched Australia, just to be clear. But if you follow the news, you'll know that we've just got approval to join the NPP, which is the new payments platform over there, as a direct participant, and we're the first fintech to do so. And by the time we've integrated, which we hope to do next year, that means we'll be directly integrated, and payments into and out of Australia are going to be instant and much cheaper as we scale, which is pretty cool. But it wasn't always that cool. We started out back in 2014, and things were very, very different then. Australia was topping our wish list. So at Wise, often the way we thought about expansion over the years was, what do our customers want? Where do they want to send money to or from? And we had this little feature on our website where they could ask us and tell us what currencies that we should add next. And Australia had this huge wave of interest, and it's a country that's got a lot of expats and a lot of immigration, so that makes sense. And we used this tool to make that decision, and started this process of how on earth do we launch in Australia, the other side of the world, like as far away from the original sort of Wise as you could imagine. And what that meant was we had this very explosive growth when we did launch. So our customers were there, they told us they wanted it, we built something that allowed them to use Wise. And this really validated our methodology of, like, if we go to where the customers are asking, that's probably a good strategy for expansion. In addition, the other thing we saw in Australia that I think really powered this was that the big banks there were charging a lot in terms of how they operated. I think that happens everywhere, but particularly in that market, there was a massive discrepancy between what we were going to offer and what the incumbents there offered. And we really felt that we could disrupt the market. I mentioned already briefly that the makeup of Australia was really conducive to this growth as well. So around 30% of that population is made up of individuals that were born overseas, and another 20% of that population have at least one parent who was born overseas. So 75% of Australians have transferred money overseas, but very few of them actually understood the true cost that banks were charging them, this typical sort of upfront fee and some markup on the exchange rate. So we saw this fast growth in Australia very early on, and we did that without having to put big budgets behind it with marketing, which is pretty cool. That saves our customers money and makes us more cheaper and efficient. And this is a real trend for us at Wise. So historically, a lot of our new users join Wise through word-of-mouth recommendations. And we knew that Australia had a really huge word-of-mouth recommendation for our product, and that directly translated into our growth. So the picture you can see here is a good example of how we tried to encourage that. And alongside that, we obviously had to launch a great product and make it cheaper and faster and more convenient than the banks that were already allowing people to send money overseas. But the way you talk to your community about your product is really critical, and that was a big part of what we think made that a success for us. The way we truly localize ourselves in a region is through very personal community and customer-led initiatives and marketing. So in 2017, again, before my time at Wise, we launched Aussies Without Borders on the UN International Migrants Day. And this was marketing that didn't just show our product, but it also the people and the community and the relevance of that product to them. And we commissioned some research around how immigrants and their importance in society are viewed in Australia. And we did some of this stuff to really complement and put the context around the product that we were offering customers there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey. So like I said, it wasn't linear. This makes it look linear. There was probably a little bit of zigzag and back and forth. But broadly, our expansion blueprint has a few common things. So it's a phased approach, and we don't launch the full thing in one go at the start. Typically, we start off by getting an initial license or a partner that helps us send money between currencies. And initially, we started out with teams in Estonia and Singapore who were going to think about how we launched in Australia. So we didn't even have anyone in the country. And progressively, we built that up. We do now have an office over there in Sydney and a small one in Melbourne, but that took time. So after we got the initial thing working, we launched our multi-currency account a couple of years later, and then we moved on to actually applying for our own license, an ADI license. And then shortly after that, we launched our card, and then we launched our service to banks in that country via the API, and continued to start adding on extra features, so allowing customers to set up direct debits from their multi-currency account, letting them use Google Pay. And then eventually, by 2021, we've got to the point where a payment to Australia from the UK happens in under 20 seconds, and 99.3% of those payments are now automated, which is pretty cool. When you think of how far away Australia is, for a payment to get there in under 20 seconds is pretty swift. So I guess the summary here is we think a lot of companies will throw a lot of money into the problem, and at Wise, really what we do is take a different approach. We think less about marketing and firing money into that, and more about actually like what do customers want and how do we do the most with the least, and really get that like high ROI on how we build our product out gradually and methodically, and building it in a way that the customers actually really want to use it. Final bit, I mentioned we're pretty big on customer-led marketing, and Wise really does grow by word of mouth. It's our biggest driver of growth in every market, not just Australia. And it doesn't get much better than discovering when customers actually do your marketing for you and make signs for you. And this apparently was spotted in a park in Sydney. We do have some marketing budget, but this stuff is probably more authentic and really does help us. So I'm going to hand back to Matt. That's the scrappy Wise take on expansion, and it's worked pretty well for us. Australia's going well. I'd love to hear how you think about this at Stripe. And UAE is a market that's close to our hearts here. We're trying to do that one, and we're starting to build out our product there, and I can definitely empathise with the challenges that you're probably going to talk through.
Yeah. Well, and congrats on the Australia launch. So even if that's for predecessors. So maybe before I jump into the detail of the UAE, what you'll see is it took a long time, and actually that's a common pattern that we often choose, like when we face going deep in a country and adding a new payment method, or going for geographic breadth and adding a new country, we tend to face this sort of decision about whether to do it quickly or whether to do it slowly, depending on what sort of product experience you want to create. And we always do it the way that will enable the product experience to be completely consistent across payment methods, across countries. And the end result means that for a Stripe merchant, you can add a new country or add a new payment method with extremely little work. And so and that was the first time, because in the past, payments companies had always sort of pursued what they thought was the best ROI way to expand coverage, and so they would end up with a product experience whereby, as a developer implementing their system, the API would be this like very thinly veiled layer over whatever the payment method or the country's functionality was, in such a way that each bit of functionality you launched, it was like implementing a whole new payment company. And so new capabilities would be projects that were multiple months. And so the way that we do it is we want a Stripe company that's, say, based in the UK, but they're also setting up a subsidiary in the UAE. We want them to be able to just like flip a toggle and everything's the same. And the code that they implemented for operating Stripe in the UK just functions in the same way. And so a lot of the decisions that we took sort of reflect agonizing over trying to make that experience the same, and that really sort of made things harder, but ultimately has created what I think was a much more differentiated product when we did launch. So a bit about why the UAE. It's a pretty big market, so order of magnitude $20 billion of internet commerce already, and growing pretty rapidly, so 50% every 2 years. And I would say that was probably sort of one of maybe three main factors that led us there. The other two were that there was a lot of overlap with where our existing users wanted us to be because of their global expansion plans, and this is, has some similarity with how you described Australia. The third was that we could see that there was this burgeoning startup scene in Dubai, and so the Gulf countries sort of generally are now have a more flourishing startup tech scene. Dubai in particular is emerging as a hub for that. There's dramatically more venture investment going into startups, and we believe that there will be some sort of the next iconic tech companies are going to be built from there, in the same way that 20 years ago in Europe you would sometimes struggle, or in London you would sometimes struggle to find those iconic tech companies, and now there's much more of a community. So we realized that was something that was good timing for Stripe and was attractive to Stripe, and also it's like in pursuit of our mission, we want to actually help to bring about that change in the region. So that's a bit about why. If we jump into the timeline of sort of how we went about building things, I mentioned earlier about this need to invest in cross-functional work early, and so for the UAE, that was really understanding the regulatory environment, sort of also understanding how the regulatory environment is going to change. They're actually pushing through some regulatory changes at the moment, and then really thinking about like how is the market different. In some countries, it's about different payment methods. In the UAE, it's about like how are we going to work with partners? How are we going, if we're going to be a regulated direct participant that's a licensed payment company? Are we going to work with a bank sponsor? How are we going to handle payouts and all this sort of stuff? So we work those things out. We started by sort of sending people out, I think I mentioned, and then have now started to employ people locally. That has been, it's one of these things where in retrospect you think, why didn't we do that earlier? And I think that was a lesson learned for us, that sometimes just getting local insight is, it's hard to overstate how important that's going to be. And so that was definitely part of the path for us for the UAE. And then on the next slide, I describe a bit about sort of thinking about some of those location differences. You have things like that are more obvious, like 3 decimal currencies, but then in the region, which become important for users that are based in Dubai and selling around the region. Then you have things like the way that you contact merchants, or that bank partners do settlement on weekends that are not the same weekends as like the weekends in other parts of the world. And there's just tiny little things that in all of the countries that you launched in the preceding years, there may be some things like this that are just different. And so no matter how much you think you have a playbook for things, you suddenly discover that there's a country that kind of overturns that playbook, and you need to work out how to do it differently. And so those are all reasons why having a team that was really focused around the mission of launching in the UAE as a sort of a singular goal was something that was vital for us to get it done. So yeah, I think that was it on the UAE. So I guess back to you, Sharon.
Cool. Okay. So that's a good segue. I think the learnings from doing this are going to be quite an interesting way to wrap up. And clearly, when you go into new markets, there's always something you're not expecting. We've seen that many times at Wise. So
it's mood lighting.
So let's wrap up with that. So I'll start with what have we learned at Wise? And there's many things, so this is definitely not an extensive list. But I think the first one is that actually focus is really important. And Matt, you were saying that a lot. It's like, having a team that's really clustered around a particular goal is really critical, because you'll go faster as a result. There's so many things you can do, though, so actually picking that focus is pretty challenging. But we've seen that when we try and do too many things, the quality drops or the things move slower. So picking one thing and doing it really well is really critical. And when we talk about priding ourselves on building what our customers really want, and we rely on our ability to build a 10x product so that we can actually grow, this is really important for us at Wise. So the second one is, I've talked a little bit about our autonomous teams, and I really do think this works for us. This model helps us to scale very quickly because in parallel, we could be deepening our connections in, for example, Australia, but then launching in another market at the same time. And the real power here is that we empower those teams to do that and solve those problems themselves and drive that growth. And we don't slow them down by saying, hey, wait for the other one that's still going over here so that someone can sign off your project. It's also a really fun way of doing it as a product person. You get this amazing autonomy as a product manager that I think in many organizations you just don't get. And that was personally one of the things that really drew me to Wise, was that it wouldn't be so prescriptive and sort of handled by a small group of people that fire out instructions to those teams. And then the final one, which may sound a bit trivial, but when you're doing this every day, is actually quite important. It really helps you to deal with time zones, because if you imagine, if you're thinking about Singapore, New York, London, you could end up just being awake all the time, and the meetings have become a real headache. And in a global company, it just makes a lot of sense to let those regions operate autonomously and separately. And it also means that I don't have so many early mornings, which is, frankly, a really good thing. So, Matt, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What are the learnings?
So, some of what I described about the kind of the life cycle of launching a new country is really you could think of it as a strong user orientation. So it's an assumption that you need to relearn, how is it that users in the market operate here? And a kind of a failure mode is to just sort of assume that you know rather than ask. And a lot of times people sort of think that product managers have a kind of a magic potion for kind of demystifying what it is that customers want. But so often it is just calling some businesses and asking them. And sometimes you see Stripe product managers will just send out a tweet, hey, what should we do? Or they're on Hacker News or something like that, and or an equivalent kind of thing. And that's where we get actually a lot of signal. And it's Stripe Tax that we launched earlier this year from the team in Europe was actually the most requested product on Twitter for Stripe to do, and so and then when we launched it, it was the most liked tweet that Stripe had done about a launch. So often just the simple asking users is really a key thing. The other things here are I think I'll sort of go off piste a bit here and talk a bit about the type of people as well. So you kind of need people that are generalists in the sense that they not only have a skill set that means they can do a variety of things, but they're the sort of people who are happy to do a lot of things. They want the outcome, and so they will spend time with a customer that's unhappy instead of thinking that that's something for customer service, or they'll follow up and spend a lot of time trying to work through something with a legal counsel instead of thinking that that's something that the legal counsel should just handle on their own. And so you need this scrappy mentality and people that are really find that satisfying as well. And so I think it's even though that's something that is often something that we look for in product managers, it's also a trait that I think needs to be present in those different functional participants in the country team. So that's a lesson learned. And then prioritization. A lot of the big quandary with international expansion is how much breadth versus how much depth, and it's something that we are always sort of not only executing on a particular stance on that question, but we're also kind of always re-questioning ourselves about have we got it right, and how should we change the mix of investing in depth versus breadth. And in that case, I think what you really need in a company is advocates for for both sides, and actually that creates constructive debate, and you should welcome that and not assume that there's going to be consensus about how you prioritize countries or how you allocate investment across all of these things. For one of the frameworks that I've found useful as an advocate for global expansion has been this message of long-termism, that actually if you are orienting for your company's success in 10 years' time, then you shouldn't be satisfied with the fact that local depth has a more immediate return on investment, because actually on a 10-year time horizon, you need to start laying the foundation for a whole different source of addressable market. And so this, like optimizing for revenue, can take on a whole different meaning depending on the time frame that you're optimizing for. And the further you look out in the future, the more likely you'll think, wow, we like have to be big in Asia Pacific. We have to be big in Nigeria. We have to be big in Brazil, because all of these countries are going to be so significant in the future, and that sort of global mentality is so intrinsic to our mission.
Cool, thanks, Matt. So we're going to wrap up there. It's been great hearing about your experience of expansion at Stripe, and actually it does sound very similar to Wise, on reflection. So we're going to wrap up there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.